Well, I'm delighted to be back in Iowa. When they called and asked if somebody from the Center for Media Literacy in Los Angeles could come out, I said, I will, because I did teach in Iowa. I'm also a Ottumwa. I've been in Ottumwa a number of times, lived there for a few years. I'm a sister of the Humility of Mary from the Iowa area. So I went to Ottumwa Heights for a while, and I graduated from Marycrest and taught in Marshalltown. I taught at Assumption High School here in the Quad City area. And I come back to the Quad Cities quite often because our sisters are here and we have meetings and committees and all that stuff. So I was delighted to be able to come into Iowa, and I would continue to be available in the future. Since I left Iowa, I've moved into California. I've been there almost 30 years and have worked. I graduated from the Annenberg School for Communication at USC, where I learned about the international media literacy movement, although it wasn't called that at the time. And I think some of you know, a few of you know, that for many years I published a magazine. Let's see, I'll put this over here just in case you've seen the front cover. It's called Media and Values. There have been some kind of famous issues: redesigning women, men, myth, and media, children in the media, elderly in the media, racism, ethnicity, all of those issues. For 15 years, from 1977 to 1993, I published that magazine. And many people call it kind of the charcoal from which the media literacy flame in the United States burst forth. I think perhaps one of the more important things that happened was in 1989, I attended a conference in Toulouse, France. And let me put the overhead up, which will elucidate that. Can we see all of that? In Toulouse, France, I attended a conference where I learned that there were 4 things that were needed to develop media literacy in any country. The first is curriculum frameworks and guidelines by some authority. We'll come back and talk about these in just a minute. The second is teacher training, both pre-service and in-service. And then thirdly, professional teacher support, like conferences to go to and newsletters to read and professional journals, summer institutes. And finally, educational resources and teaching tools. Of course, textbooks for many years, but increasingly now videotapes and CD-ROMs and websites and all of that. Well, as a magazine publisher, I was aware that these 4 things were needed, and I came back to the United States. There was only 3 of us there from the United States. And I came back and said, well, what can I do about frameworks? I don't have a PhD. I don't work at the State Department of Education, nor do I work at the federal department. And in this country particularly, we don't have standards nationally, like Britain or Australia or other countries which can mandate it nationally in a national curriculum. It was going to take 50 states, and as I've come to understand here in Iowa, you don't even have state standards, you have district standards. So you've got 360 districts instead of even one district having to establish state standards, as we do in California. We have state standards. So there wasn't much I could do there. In terms of teacher education, there wasn't much I could do there because that meant you have to be teaching somewhere at Columbia or even at Marycrest. I wasn't even on the faculty there. So I couldn't do much about that. Teacher preparation or teacher support, if there are no teachers teaching it, you can't have an organization supporting it. So that seemed to be kind of impossible. But at the bottom was development of media teaching materials. And I did publish a magazine. So I felt that if we just transformed the publication a bit, perhaps we could begin to drive media literacy from the bottom up. By developing resources, we would give teachers the materials that would drive the teacher training and ultimately the standards. And so I began to work on developing what many now call the first generation of teaching tools. And for example, I just showed you those 2 issues of Media and Values magazine on men and women, then that was soon followed by a leader's guide with handout masters of resource materials, how to write a letter, how media images affect our lives, and there would be lesson plans. These are not profound, they're just books of lesson plans, and handout masters, which would often have videotapes to go with them, and so there's a whole collection in our catalog, and one of the things I sent you in the packet was the catalog of resource materials that are now distributed by the Center for Media Literacy. And if you did not get that, we'll make sure you get one, because we are now, so let me just finish the story. In 1990, we started publishing those resource materials up until about 1995, and then we realized we didn't have to publish a lot of things ourselves. More and more people were getting in on the Publishing Act. What we needed was a national distribution system. And so the center has created a national distribution center. And let me just show you the front cover of the catalog so you'll recognize it when it comes in. This is our 1999-2000 catalog, 24 pages of teaching materials about media literacy, for and about media literacy. And we pretty much kind of vet all the resource materials that are out there and make sure that they follow the criteria, which are which is written on the inside. You can't read this small type, of course, but the criteria for how we select resources in this catalog is clearly identified. And most of those resources are we believe they are pedagogically sound. Their content must be relevant for media literacy. They must be empowering and not media bashing or censorship promoting. They must be affordable, and we must be able to get them in quantities to be able to run a distribution service so people, when they order, will get their order. So we also specialize in materials from other countries. For example, Canada, and I want to talk a little bit about Canada, which has, in 1986, developed media literacy. It really grew out of teachers concerned about the development of media, critical skills about the media culture that kids were growing up in. And in 1989, let's see, let me put this over here. In 1989, the Department of Education, or the Ministry of Education, as they call it up in Ontario, published this book called the Media Literacy Resource Guide, which is their framework. And this is available through the center. It might be quite useful to those of you who are working on standards and working on curriculum frameworks to see what Canada's done, because they, why reinvent the wheel? They've created what it is that everybody needs to know about the media by the time they graduate from high school. And with those standards and frameworks, they have publishers have started developing textbooks. The CBC, the National Film Board of Canada has developed materials. And so there's a whole industry going on up in Canada. And many publishers have developed materials that are quite useful in the United States. So we have a number of, in some cases, exclusive distribution arrangements with these publishers. An example of one that's probably the best resource about teaching the media is a book called Screening Images, Ideas for Media Education by Chris Worsnop. He is a practiced veteran teacher in media literacy. He's one of the ringleaders of the media literacy movement in Canada, and his book is now in its 2nd edition, and it's what I call the hip pocket guide to media literacy. It's we just can hardly keep them on the shelves because it's a very accessible, small paperback, $15 or $16 or $17, something like that. Very accessible, hundreds of ideas. It has 3 parts to it. The first 40 pages are basically a pedagogy, a theory of media literacy. The second set of 40 pages are practical essays about teaching media literacy in the classroom, praxis ideas. And the last 40 pages are suggestions for classroom activities and actual kind of like mini lesson plans and ideas for how to do it. So in one book is a great resource, and many people like Renee Hobbs in Boston or Fran Trampetz at the University of Dayton use it as kind of the primer in their graduate classes in media literacy. So I just offer that as a kind of a beginning. But let's look a little bit at maybe what we're talking about in terms of what is media literacy. I like to think that media literacy is basically three things. There is a kind of a standard definition of media literacy, the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and produce media in a variety of forms. Well, that's a bit academic, I think. People say, what do you mean by access? What do you mean by evaluate? Those are kind of loaded words. I prefer to use more of a graphic, and we'll come back and talk about this in a minute in perhaps a little bit of discussion, but I think media literacy is really three things. It's balancing, it's learning to balance our media diet, and by that I mean both time and choice. It's learning how much you watch and what you choose. Now, a lot of this work is done very early in a child's life, or should be done very early in a child's life, at the preschool level. And we have a number of resources, and we're working with organizations like the PTA, or now the American Academy of Pediatrics. If you remember this past summer, they started taking a media history of all children as part of the pediatric workup of every child. And they're now in the midst of trying to train 53,000 pediatricians to do this over the next 10 years. Well, this will be a wonderful opportunity for pediatricians who are very much opinion leaders in the lives of young parents. They're the most respected authority in a parent's life, to intervene, especially when television or media use interferes with the child's physical or emotional development, their weight, their amount of exercise, their nutrition, their sleep patterns, those kinds of issues. And so the pediatricians have become involved in working with young parents, and we certainly welcome that. And the PTA's become involved in that, and the American Association for the Education of Young Children. Others are all working kind of at both parent education and child education, because the child depends on the parent at this point. That's not to say that all of us can't use a little help sometimes in balancing our media diet, but for the most part, this work is done should be done primarily at the elementary level. And I don't know how many of your AEA programs work with parent education, but you just might need to know that that's where a lot of work is being developed and probably should most likely reside. I tell one story about working with young parents. I have a friend, Michael, and his wife Janet, who a few years ago had a 2-year-old or a 20-month-old named Nicholas. And Michael called me one day and said, we were talking on the phone, I said, what's up? He said, well, Janet and I just went out and bought an armoire. And I said, well, what did you buy an armoire for? And he said, well, we've decided that we want an armoire, as you know, has doors on it to close the television. It's a big kind of entertainment center thing, and they run $1,000, $1,200, $1,500 to $2,500 if you buy a real expensive one. And he said, well, we decided we had to have an armoire so that Nicholas would know that we put the television away and we close the door and it goes to sleep, just like he has to take a nap or put his toys away in the toy box when he finishes. And it's those kinds of habits of mind that I think parents need to learn, and we need to help them develop. So if we go back to the other part, that balancing our media diet is only one strand of media literacy. And however, it is one place where a lot of people get hung up, is on balancing the diet. But there's far more two other places that I think are more the purview of schools, particularly critical viewing, learning both analysis and production, learning how to see what's on the screen, how to analyze the visual culture, how to take apart and the embedded values in of media piece, being able to critique it and analyze it, and of course a lot of that comes from producing it yourself and understanding editing and those things. And then the third one would be critical analysis and advocacy, asking the larger questions, political, economic, and social. These are the more tough issues, like the impact of violence in our culture, or what is the impact of 12-year-old girls seeing teenage magazines and none of the models are over 103 pounds. You know, what does that do to their self-esteem? How do we work with those children?